desire. Well, I'm a man on fire.
Of Iowa was the sole sponsor on this bill that stops the FBI from performing background checks on people adjudicated to be mentally ill, and now he's stating for the record, well, it's a shame that the FBI isn't doing background checks on these mentally ill people. Well, duh! You took that opportunity away last year! The people in the government who were voted into power are lying to us. And us kids seem to be the only ones who notice and are prepared to call BS. Companies trying to make caricatures of the teenagers nowadays, saying that all we are is self-involved and trend-obsessed, and they hush us into submissions when our message doesn't reach the ears of the nation. We are prepared to call BS. Their gilded House and Senate seats funded by the NRA telling us nothing could have ever been done to prevent this. We call BS! You're ruthless! Stone cold! I gave every inch of my soul! Well, I'm a man! They say that no laws could have been able to prevent the hundreds of senseless tragedies that have occurred. We call BS! That us kids don't know what we're talking about, that we're too young to understand how the government works. We call BS! If you agree, register to vote, contact your local congresspeople, give them a piece of your mind.
Hello, humans. Welcome back to the Slackline Quote of the Day broadcast. You are here with the boss.
The boss is coming! That's a made-up, dumb fairy tale name, you
And we are talking quotes, back to quotes. We had our first edition of the Slackline Friday Sports on Friday. Hope everybody enjoyed that. Hope everybody enjoyed the weekend. We had a few days off of the news quotes last week. Took some quotes from movies and stuff like that. Today we are getting back to some current events, some very sad current events. The shooting in Florida, obviously more information out about it now since the last time we talked about it. The shooter was a student, had, I guess, purchased legal guns somehow, and he had a long history of disturbing behavior towards his fellow students, and I guess they had diagnosed him with some behavioral disorder, and he ends up shooting up a school, getting his hand on some guns and shooting up a school. And so with that in mind, we will go to our quote today. Who's bringing us our quote today there, Jerry? Looking at my paper, a new AR-17 Teacher Edition, preloaded with Gold Star ammo. Teach them a lesson with the AR-17 Teacher Edition. That seems wildly inappropriate, but there are obviously a lot of people out there that think arming teachers and arming students and arming everybody is the solution to this type of problem. Today our quote comes from a young student who was at the school at the time of the shooting, and watched friends die and watched teachers die, and now is leading the charge in trying to bring about change in this regard. And a quote from her speech, heard before there in the intro, but I will repeat it here. The people in the government who are voted into power are lying to us, and us kids seem to be the only ones who notice and are prepared to call BS. That is Emma Gonzalez. young student at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, where the horrible shooting happened just a few days ago. And so I didn't really want to talk so much about the gun violence as much as talk about I wanted to talk about the consequences of youth and revolt, and look at the past a little bit and see what that looked like in other times of dramatic change. And I've long said that that if there's one good thing about Trump and this type of behavior that's going on, is that it will shake people out of apathy towards government and towards voting and towards, just the idea that you can make a difference at all and drive people towards change. And the most recent spot we can take is the civil rights movement. Is all of this stuff started happening as people became enlightened about issues that other people faced, issues that black people were facing were obvious to black people for a long time, and they started standing up for themselves, and then people started to see through pictures and journalism and stuff, what was happening in those communities. And then so other people start getting up in arms, and all of a sudden you have hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people at marches and rallies. Not just black people, not just feminists, not just environmentalists, like people that would put themselves in all of those categories. They all started marching. They all started actually feeling like their voice could be heard. And I listened to this young girl speak who can't be older than 16, and she inspires me as like, wow, like this young woman got up and called out the president of her country and called out the leadership of her country, and for their inaction, for their silence, and for their complicity in this type of issue, in this type of incident. That takes a lot of guts to do something like that, to stand up with microphones and TV cameras on you and tell the people and say to the most powerful people in the world that they're full of shit. And that's what she did, and that's what all these students are doing. I watched a couple other interviews with other students and teachers that went through this stuff. And the way they're speaking about it is totally different than what I've seen before. They're obviously traumatized and obviously hurt by what happened, but they are activated. They are, in action, and they are, not going to be silenced by like sadness or calls for prayers and all that type of stuff. And it's really inspiring to see. And when you look back on that stuff, when you look back on people like Martin Luther King, like Malcolm X, like JFK, like all these people who were leaders in action in the past, circumstances were very, very similar. A lot of people fighting against progress and against massive change, not small incremental change, but people recognizing, a large group of people recognizing that massive change needs to happen, and another large group of people fearing or resisting that change. And it started this stuff all over the world, and in anti-war protests with harsh police response, Soviet revolutions in a lot of different places, in Czech Republic and other places where Soviets were strong-arming, Mexico City deaths during the Olympic protests, and on down the list. All this stuff starts to happen, and unfortunately violence starts to happen. Assassinations of all these people who were speaking out, either for or against. And the most famous ones, JFK, Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, Malcolm X. I don't think it's out of the question that we start to see stuff like that happen. Security and everything surrounding these people is a totally different animal than it was then, but they still come into contact with people, and you never know, especially in the U.S., who could be carrying a weapon. And you get one of these kids, one of these 16-year-old kids that decides to go try to send a message the other way, and politicians start to end up dead. But yeah, out of all that protest and whatnot came like a lot of fear of young people, a fear of change, and you started to see a rise of conservatism and Nixon getting into power, and starting the war on drugs and that type of thing, and bringing in lots of legislation that continued to suppress rights under the guise of security, or worse, under the guise of freedom, whether that's religious freedom, gun rights freedom, used to excuse the restriction of other people's rights of safety, people's rights of medical procedures like abortion and that type of thing. All these legal battles start to fight to enact the legislative, the real put down on paper change that the marches and the violence and all that stuff symbolizes. A big difference during the civil rights movements as opposed to now is that they had leadership like JFK and Lyndon Johnson and Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and these people who did push in the legislative, or did push in the executive side for this type of change. JFK sat down and made speeches about how they need to heal this type of divide at home in order to be a beacon abroad, and how they need to and he sent the National Guard to let black students into segregated schools and all that type of stuff. It's the total opposite of what's happening now, where the leadership is the people who are pushing for regression and fighting against change, and so in this type of instances, when you have a wave of you'll have protests come up against leadership in much the same way, but unfortunately you don't have a figurehead. You don't have these important figureheads that are really the voices for these things, the symbolic leaders for these things. And maybe you don't need those people because they just probably end up creating martyrs, unfortunately, I want to say fortunately, but an assassination or something can spark change. Although as we can see from these types of gun shootings and how frequent they are, they don't seem to spark change. But maybe this time will. So I have to kind of question if more violence is coming, and if there is going to be a pushback of violence, and if you're going to start to see terrorists, domestic terrorist groups rise up that start trying to take out people like Trump and people like Mitch McConnell and people like the Koch brothers and all these corrupt diplomats and business tycoons and whatnot that are real problems. We've said it before on here about a joke about bringing back the guillotine, but there's an argument that people need to be made an example of sometimes, and there's also an argument that this side of things, that the side of progressivism and the side of tolerance and however you want to put it has been putting up with too much for too long, in kind of the vain hope that people will slowly start to come this way, but eventually change has to happen whether people like it or not. And some people seem to be willing to fight against that change enough to hurt other people and themselves, and it's really unfortunate to see. So hopefully these kids can spark some change. That's probably it for today. That quote again from student Emma Gonzalez from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida. The people in the government who are voted into power are lying to us, and us kids seem to be the only ones who notice and are prepared to call BS. That is Emma Gonzalez, giving myself and other adults hope for humanity, and honestly bringing a tear to my eye with a little bit of passion and engagement in the process, and hopefully she can become a driving force for change. And that quote, again, very inappropriately brought to us by the new AR-17 Teacher Edition, preloaded with gold star ammo. Teach them a lesson with AR-17 Teacher Edition. Thanks again to the Crooked Spies for providing some music for us today. Make sure you're following the Slackline on Instagram at the.slack.line, on Twitter at slackline_radio, and on YouTube at the Slackline Podcast and iTunes as well. You have been listening to The Boss.
The boss is coming.
That's a made-up dumb fairy tale name, you.
This has been Quote of the Day for Monday, February 19th, 2018. Thanks to anybody paying attention. Thanks to Jerry in the booth. And hopes that everybody has a good day. All right, bye for now.
Hey, mama, hey. Hey, mama, I've seen you around, messing with all the boys in this town. Hey, mama. Hey, mama, hey. You burn this whole place down just to wear the crown. What you need, but I never met a woman with so much cream. Hey mama, hey mama, hey, hey mama, I've seen you around, messing with all the poor boys in this town. Hey mama, hey mama, hey, you just to wear the crown.